on how they want to implement this stuff. We don't set standards for what the card design is supposed to look like. We don't set the standard. All we say is you got to have a machine-readable zone. You got to have security features on it. The states have developed them themselves. As a matter of fact, the AMVA, which is the American Association of Motor Vehicle Administrators, they basically, in conjunction with the states, develop card design standards, and they've been doing this for years on how the driver's license is supposed to look, even well before September 11th. So it's more so in a way, is to get back to your question, is that it's the part of it is it's the two components put together, just not the one, because anybody can fake a license. I mean, and it just depends on to what level you're utilizing the fake license for. But the important component is the verification process and the document process.
Question?
Sure.
I guess I like you guys to play devil's advocate with each other. What aspects of the Real ID program, this is a gentleman's committee, so do you find salvageable or useful? And for you, which ones do you find the weakest or that should be scrapped or maybe revamped?
Well, one of the things, and this is where I said earlier that I'll put two different hats on. Because my first hat was with PennDOT, and when Real ID came out, there were a number of things in Real ID that just didn't sit well with us at all. And a couple of them are some of the most egregious ones that we feel, when I was with PennDOT at the time, was the actual branding of the licenses. That we knew was going to be an issue with a number of states, particularly when you have to put on a license that if it's a non-U.S. citizen who's here on a temporary visa, you have to actually put on the license that it's temporary. Or that if you, as the state, decide that you want to have an alternative process for issuing driver's licenses that didn't quite meet the standards, which there are states out there that do. Utah's a good example. Utah issues a driving certificate, but it's not used for identification. A number of other states wanted to be able to give their citizens an option to say, okay, I'll issue a Real ID, but our other license we're not going to mark it anyway at all, because why would we want to put alternative markings on the licenses? So that's one of the bigger issues. One of the other parts of Real ID that presents a little bit of a problem is that there are certain classifications of non-U.S. citizens who are legally here in the United States but don't meet the Real ID requirements. And so it's very difficult for states to go through and look, one of the things that as the states that we wanted to prevent was our DMV clerks from becoming immigration agents. And that was one of the issues, is that the states, all we wanted to know as a state is this person allowed to be in the United States or not, and then we'll decide how long we want to issue them a license for. And not let it up to go through a convoluted process to make a determination on, well, they're legally present, and do they also meet certain criteria of being legally present. So those are the types of issues that we have to deal with. And some of them, too, deal with the misconceptions of Real ID. Real ID was never actually publicized properly. It was kind of, there's Real ID, go on your way. So we get the misconceptions of the national database, which there's no national database for Real ID. What it is we're going to be able to connect to the other databases just to verify information. Like right now, Pennsylvania gets information back from Social Security. If they put your name and Social Security number in there, it just comes back and say, yes, that's correct. Or they'll send back a code, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that says that something doesn't match. And if it's a 1, that means that the dates of birth aren't matching, but they don't send us any information back. The database that's going to connect the states for verification for driver's licenses, all it's going to be able to do is, no information is going to pass through. All it's going to say is, no, this person doesn't have a driver's license here, or yes, they do. So there's a little bit of misconceptions about the databases too. So.
All right, we'll come back to your question, but we think that creates a database, that creates a central repository for a lot of information, and that becomes attractive to identity thieves. I should mention, and the reason why I started the discussion by talking about Patriot Act and FISA Amendments Act and some other things is because I want you guys to understand that we feel like, and you can see this on our website, that we are increasingly moving into a surveillance society. I want to mention E-Verify. E-Verify is an online database program which takes databases from the Social Security Administration and the Department of Homeland Security and puts them on the internet. Now, the purpose is for employers who voluntarily participate to supposedly verify someone's work eligibility, but the reality is the databases have errors that lead to either unauthorized workers being authorized or vice versa. People who are eligible come back as unauthorized. But that can very easily be converted into a national identity system. Employers are able to access that information right now. Very easy to just change it and have more people who can have access. To your question. I'm somewhat nervous to answer it because I didn't mention this at the beginning, but I work for the ACLU of Pennsylvania, which is one of 53 state affiliates. I know there aren't 53 states, but we have affiliates in Puerto Rico and DC, and a couple of states have too. But I don't speak for them directly. I can tell you that we have not had any objections to most of what PennDOT is doing, with the exception of the facial recognition technology they're using. Otherwise, we've had no objections to the security requirements they've been using now, getting documents from people. This was actually the first I'd heard about storing the documents, so I'm a little concerned about that. The national database is a big deal. There's an alternative to Real ID called Pass ID, which my understanding is that it takes away the database requirement, but still has some of the verification requirements of Real ID. The government associations, like the National Governors Association, have dropped their opposition. They're okay with Pass ID. They oppose Real ID. Same thing with the State Legislators Association, National Conference of State Legislatures. So in some ways, I'm sort of getting around your question, but I don't want to say anything on behalf of our national organization. They have to make that decision. I can tell you again that states have a right, of course, to secure their documents. And if there are privacy issues when the states do that, then we'll fight those battles.
That was an excellent question, by the way. I saw some more hands. Yes, sir.
For Mr. Hoover, you frame your argument about infringing personal rights, but you also see this as a federalism issue, and that it takes away state rights to do as they please with driver's license, because the other gentleman said that historically the states have come together to say, look at our internal problems. So can't the federal government just knock on the state's door and say, hey, can you do this because we've witnessed this as a result of 9/11 as opposed to passing a legislation?
That's a good question. The ACLU does not put as much emphasis on that argument, but we do work with people who are adamant that the state has a right and the federal government should just butt out. Now, the federal government will say, we're not making them do anything. But if they don't do it, X, Y, and Z will happen. Raising the drinking age, and they said, oh, you don't have to raise the drinking age, but we're going to take away all your highway funds. So it's the same thing with Real ID. I guess in a legal sense, that's a way to get around it, but I do work with advocates who think that it is a states' rights issue. I also work with advocates who think that, and not only advocates, but people who are living their lives this way, they think that for religious reasons, they don't want to have a social security number. So if PennDOT gives them some hassle about not having a social security number, their feeling is, Steve says it's a privilege, but they're saying, look, for religious reasons, First Amendment, freedom of expression reasons, I don't have a social security number. Can you help me out? And I've heard mixed reactions to that. I've heard that there are people who have had PennDOT agents who will work with them and others who aren't so helpful. So.
Well, I would say, one of the things, that I'll go back, because a lot of these requirements that PennDOT has now, I worked on those, all those requirements. One of the things that we were very careful of, whenever we were instituting a lot of the requirements for the driver's licenses and the ID cards, is that we did work with a lot of special interest groups, outside agencies, particularly when we implemented our lawful presence requirement in Pennsylvania. And actually, we did that the law was passed in 2003. So it was well before Real ID even was on a drawing board at that particular point. And so at that particular aspect, the state, and like I mentioned before, the states were already moving in this direction. Now, there's a couple schools of thought of, did Real ID move the process faster, or did it slow the process down? And so, I could give you two different answers because I worked for two different places, or I worked for two different places. And so from the state's perspective, they're going to say, Real ID, you slowed us down. We were already moving in that direction. We had this thing called out here, the driver license agreement. It was state-centric. we're doing this thing, you just tag along with us. And that's kind of the process with, that was, as far as the negotiated rulemaking. That's what was moving in that direction, and a lot of states supported that process. But then what happened is that kind of got derailed a little bit. So you had states then that took an opposite posture to that. And so you came up with some of these fantastic numbers that the states threw out as far as how much it was going to cost for Real ID. Used a $100 million figure. Well, I was in the meetings that came up with that number, and that's not a good number. Because it was,
And that's it.
it basically was, okay, your worst case scenario, if you had to bring in everybody into the driver license centers within a short period of time, how much would it cost you to do that? Now, coming up with those figures even before the Real ID regulation was out there, we came up with all these figures, and all the states came up with these figures before the act was even, or the regulation was even passed. So the states didn't even know what the regulation was or what they were formulating their money on. So it was kind of like you're grasping for straws and trying to guess at what it's going to cost you. And no state in the union wanted to go down and say, gee whiz, it's only going to cost us $1 million. Yeah. So the realities of government budgeting, when you think you're going to get a windfall from another agency or another government, is that you always have a tendency to give a little higher figure than what it actually is. The other thing too is so far actually it's called the Driver License Security Grant Program. It used to be called Real ID, but we changed the name. Every state right now, with maybe the exception of 2, has requested and received grant money for improvements to the driver license process. Out of that, and since 2008, we've granted the states probably $235 million for improvements to their driver license processes. Also, the grant hasn't gone actually away. It just, the wording on how the grant, they rolled all the security grants that states into one grant program. So states are still allowed to spend money on Real ID if they choose to, on the state. So it's not an individual line item anymore, but it's still contained. The states still have the ability to do that.
I want to just make note of the fact that Steve admitted 2 minutes ago that the government said something that wasn't totally accurate.
Which government?
The number from PennDOT.
Oh, well, no. Well, I didn't say it wasn't accurate. I didn't say it wasn't accurate. I just said it was inflated.
Well, and you know what? There's been fuzzy math around Real ID almost from the start. Originally, the Department of Homeland Security said it was going to cost $23 billion. Then, like a year later, they said, maybe $11 billion. It turned out they were assuming 25% of people wouldn't get a license. I mean, numbers get bounced around, and there's all kinds of problems.
As all of you go through your career in public administration, which I hope you all go into public service, I've been a public servant for almost 30 years now. 26, 27 years. I'm not that old yet. But as you find out, particularly when it comes to budgeting and budget requests, is that there's the actual, what it's going to cost you, and what you think you can get. So I don't think I'm telling you anything that you haven't known, or figured out. Because you have to remember at the particular time that after September 11th, a lot of these programs that came into, and I can speak to driver licensing, I can't speak to any other program, is the idea of having an ability to do all the things that Real ID wants to do. The states have been pushing for that for years, but just never had the money to do it. So the thought process at that particular time is that, okay, hey, here's an opportunity that we can do some of these things that we've been wanting to do for years, but we're just never allocated the money to do. So that's kind of the state's thought process at that particular time we want these things because AMVA who's the Association for Motor Vehicles, or for driver licenses and stuff, back as early as November of 2001, 1 month, or basically 2 months after September 11th, we were already gearing up and posturing to lobby Congress to come up with money or for funding to do these things that the states had wanted to do. As that moved along, that moved into the negotiated rulemaking process, and then the tsunami relief and Real ID kind of derailed all that. But
I can tell you that sitting in the Governor Rendell's office in January of 2003, one of his specific pieces of guidance to me as his new Homeland Security Director was, quote, "Don't leave $1 on the table." In other words, if you could get something from the federal government, and the spigot was open, I described it as an era when there was more money than guidance on how to spend it effectively. Unfortunately, 10 years later, the spigot is closed, and the amounts of money reaching the state and local government levels for Homeland Security related activities has slowed to a trickle. So we now have more guidance than money. So it's sort of the nature of government. I saw some other hands. Did anybody else have any questions? I have one if you don't. And it's on behalf of a student. Misericordia University on Wednesday of last week, just before the floodwaters struck, having a discussion on this very same issue. The question came up, this is a quote from the student, a junior in the government law and national security program there, said, "If you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear." I'll throw that one to you first.
Let me rephrase that. If you're innocent, you should give up your rights. I mean, that's the way I hear that. And the fact of the matter is, I talked about some of the other surveillance in society and rolling back of our rights and things that have been going on since 9/11. Essentially, the federal government is asking us to give up our rights because of the mistakes they made. They're using 9/11 as justification. I should add, the Patriot Act, for example, it was passed as a anti-terrorism statute. It's been used in domestic law enforcement. It's been used in organized crime and drug activity. It's not just an anti-terrorism statute. In the year 2000, the CIA knew about 2 of the 9/11 hijackers. They never told President Clinton. They never told the FBI. So what they're doing with the Patriot Act and the Real ID Act and the FISA Amendments Act and other executive policies is they are asking us to give up the rights because of the mistakes they made.
And that's beyond my pay grade.
We've stepped beyond the realm of real ID on that. But the question, I mean, for a student who's 20 or 21 years old, thinking about what he might be asked to give up, or just said, if you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear. I mean, is that a legitimate thought process?
Well, I'll speak from the driver license aspect of this, because it can go into global issues that I'm not qualified to speak on. But you always have to balance, and I'll use the driver license analogy, is highway safety and a person's personal rights. And so, it comes down into that fine line. Like commercial drivers, they take a lot more, they have to do a lot more testing in order to become a commercial driver. If you want to haul hazardous materials, you have to be fingerprinted and you have to have a criminal background check. So what happens, has a tendency to happen, is security kind of, when people talk about national security and those types of things, the lines get blurred, because what you're actually talking about is safety. National security is your safety. Highway security is your safety. So you have to look at things, and there's always trade-offs. I always use the analogy, if you want to, practically eliminate highway deaths, drop the speed limit to 25 miles an hour. Now, but you have to weigh, people make the choice that says, that's unacceptable, we want our freedom of movement, so how are you going to protect our freedom of movement? Well, one of the things that governments are faced with is we got to get the bad drivers off the roads. So in order to keep bad drivers off the roads, you have to know who that driver is in the first place, so that you know he's not hiding something from you. So it's always these trade-offs, and I think you face this all the time as well. It's where does the pendulum switch between safety, convenience, rights, all those types of things? You got this pendulum. When I started with PennDOT, one of our biggest issues was customer service. We had issues where people were lining up outside the driver license centers, and it would take them 2, 3, 4 hours to go to a driver license center. So when the Ridge administration came in, they says, what we need you to do is to look at how can you streamline our process. Do what we absolutely have to do in order to keep the highway safe from bad drivers, but let's not go too far. So basically what we looked at is how do we streamline for customer service. Okay, well then that customer service is up here. Yeah, you're kind of balancing out the safety aspects and the testing aspects, and we looked at ways that we could maybe make our driver's test not as long and do types of other things. Oh, well then all of a sudden we started having other issues that dealt with safety issues. So now the pendulum started swinging the other direction. So now all of a sudden, gee whiz, the line started getting longer at the driver license centers again. So you have this, this dichotomy that you're in this constant, up and down when it comes to trying to figure out what is your particular administration's preference at any particular time. Are they more on the side of personal safety, security, those types of issues, but then other things have to suffer when that occurs. The key is to try to figure out the middle ground, but that's a hard place to find. One of the things that I did got to mention about when we did a lot of these things when we were changing our requirements for driver's licenses, and a lot of other states were putting in lawful presence requirement, and the ACLU was very active in a number of other states. But one of the approaches that we took, and we talked to a lot of privacy groups, we talked to different immigration organizations. AILA was actually AILA helped us write a lot of the stuff, and basically helped us interpret what the federal requirements were for non-citizens. But we didn't get sued, so. So we didn't do all that bad.
And Steve hit it right on the head. I mean, I hope I made clear the ACLU is not against driver's licenses. I actually work with activists who think we shouldn't have driver's licenses at all. I mean, that's pure libertarianism. We're not there, but Steve hit it. There's a line somewhere, and when ideas are debated, we just got to figure out where the line is. Obviously, organizations like ours and the American Conservative Union and the Cato Institute are going to be in one place. Oftentimes elected officials and government officials are somewhere else. We just have to work it out.
Any other questions? Comments for the good of the order? Well, I will say this. I think we've certainly had an illuminating discussion tonight. Extracted one comment, a permanent state of emergency. That's an interesting concept, a little bit frightening. Should be to all of us. I don't think anybody in political leadership would ever stand up and propose that verbally, but it's something that if we perceive we're moving in that direction on the premises that, as we well know, benefits given are hard to rescind, as we're seeing in the great debt debate facing the United States now, issues related to the costs of Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and other government programs. But on the other side of that coin, freedoms once yielded are very hard to recover. Think about that. Because once you've turned back something that you once had, it's very difficult, short of resort to extreme measures, which our fledgling nation certainly had to resort to do that. We have made progress, is what I take away from this discussion tonight. I think it is either because of or in spite of the Real ID effort at the federal level, but I think that the concepts that Steve talked about developed at the state level, that the states on their own initiative, with some prodding perhaps, have moved in the direction of improved security. And I would ask Andy, is it fair to say that to this extent so far that they've only been marginally invasive? Is that a fair assessment? I mean, that you're not ready to raise a red flag and say where we are today is a dangerous place?
I think when we take it broadly with Real ID and the Patriot Act and FISA amendments and some other things, I would say, yes, we're getting to a dangerous place. Real ID itself, we obviously have major concerns about it. I don't know if I'd say marginally invasive, but I think that we can continue to debate this and find a place to settle, I hope.
Is there common ground? Your last comments from it. Is there any place in between? What you've said tonight, Andy, what you've said tonight, Steve, should we be back at that DLA or rulemaking table again as opposed into the area of federal legislation?
Well, I'd say that the states are in motion. I mean, and that was the whole thing is that it put a spotlight on a problem that the states had had, particularly the ability of individuals to get multiple licenses. And it all comes back to that. Even if you look at everything, and you're right, the hijackers, they came into if they applied for driver's licenses, even under Real ID, if they had come in before their visas expired, they would have all gotten driver's licenses anyway. I mean, even under Real ID, they would have gotten them. But what the issue is that to get people who aren't qualified to not to have that type of document, and that's where the difficulty is. Now, could something change? The states are already in motion. Some states a little faster than other states, and they're moving in that direction. Like I said, we had anti-Real ID states, but if you look at the security of their process and their documents, they're meeting all the security requirements of Real ID. It's just politically they can't say they're doing it. So and they have the issue that says, well, we're not going to commit to Real ID because, federalism, unfunded mandate, or all these other types of things. But behind the scenes, they're all working in that direction.
They have taken responsibility.
Exactly. Because no state wants to have every poster that comes out, and I still see it every once in a while, when they talk about driver's licenses and the 9/11 hijackers, no state wants to be Florida because their license was the first one right next to the hijackers.
Yeah.
So no state wanted to be Florida when that all came out. That's why you've seen a big flurry of state activity at that particular time that says, we don't want to be there, what they're showing with a Florida license. Even though the person had legitimately gotten a Florida license, it's just they put Florida's up there first. And it was no fault of Florida's. And actually Florida has moved well ahead of most other states in meeting all of these requirements for Real ID. And they'll probably be in a position as soon as the requirement comes in that they could probably implement it without any problems.
Any final thought, Andy?
No, it's just as Steve mentioned, just to wrap up, I should mention there is something the ACLU supports.
Wait.
There was a bill.
It's the big one.
Unfortunately, I don't think it's been reintroduced this session, but there was a bill 1 or 2 sessions ago in Congress to repeal Real ID and go back to the negotiated rulemaking process where everybody could have a voice, and we would love to see that started again. So don't believe the hype. ACLU doesn't oppose everything.
And it may start right here in this classroom tonight, thanks to the Meyner Center, the departmental support, the policy studies program. And I would just leave you with these thoughts and let Professor Kincaid have the final thoughts. To you as students, what you think, what you feel, what you believe is going to make far more difference for the future of this country than anything that any of us said up here tonight, because you are the future. But stealing a little bit from my difficultly obtained philosophy degree from Lafayette, nothing you think, see, feel, believe, or say means anything if you don't do something about it. Absolutely irrelevant and meaningless unless you're prepared to devote your time, your effort to make something happen. There's a doctrine in philosophy called meliorism. Things can get better, but only if you try. And then many years later there was a Martinism, which is nothing good happens easily or accidentally. You are in exactly the right place and at the right time to do the thinking, the toolkit building, the mind stretching, the wing spreading that will allow you to have a definitive and decisive and very positive impact on this great country of ours in the years ahead, and I thank you for that.
Well,
had lots of fascinating thoughts tonight. I won't add any more thoughts. Just a couple announcements. One, there's some brochures from ACLU up here on the table if you would like to take a brochure as you leave. And also, there's pizza and soft drinks outside if you weren't hungry when you came in, but you're hungry now. And I think you can walk away with the pizza back to the dorm. I think that would be fine as well. So feel free to do that. Again, I'd like to thank Mr. Martin, who's come back to campus to moderate this program, Mr. Hoover and Mr. Kozar. Let's give them another round of applause.